Have the little clock ticking down on this one. No, I don't have the clock ticking down. Oh, there we go. 6 o'clock. Are you ready to go then?
I'm ready, yeah.
Wonderful. Let's get this started. Oh my God, I got a phone notification the second I clicked go to that. That was fun.
Huh.
Hello. Hello, everybody. So welcome to this online psychology interview workshop. We'll just give it a couple of minutes for some people to filter through, and then we can start talking. Just give it a second there. While I'm talking and while people are coming in, I think you guys should be able to see each other in the chat. So we've got a Q&A in the chat there. We might use the Q&A, we might use the chat when we're talking through the interview. So does someone mind messaging in the chat? And then if someone else can see that, that's fine. If no one can see that, thank you. So Jasmine said, hey, if other people can see that, cool. If you can't see that, just put a question in the Q&A saying you can't see that. You should be able to, I think. Oh, okay. So people can't see in the chat. Okay. So we'll use the Q&A, which is a slightly clunkier way of doing it, but that's absolutely fine. That's just the fun. Think of the Q&A basically as the chat. So if there's any questions in there, we can answer those. If not, we'll just keep them in there and use that as a chat. So I think that's the way that makes the most sense. Yeah, we can only message hosts and panelists. So, I mean, if there's a thought that you all have at any point that you don't want to share with the group, but you want to send to one of us, you can also use the chat. So that's absolutely fine. Fantastic. Wonderful, wonderful. 25 people, give it another couple seconds or so. I think we're petering out about there. Fantastic. Okay, so the numbers stopped going up there. So I think we'll officially kick this off. So hi everyone, thanks for coming along this evening. So I think some of you, I don't know people's names, but some of you, if you're with the schools we work with, you might have seen me pop in before. But if not, my name's Ben. I work at Brasenose College in Oxford. And I was a psychology student myself in an earlier life when I was a student. And I'm joined here today by my wonderful, wonderful colleague here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm also at Brasenose in Oxford. I was also an undergrad psychology student at Oxford at Brasenose, and now I'm doing a PhD in Oxford, still in psychology, still hanging around. But yeah, we're both quite knowledgeable about both Oxford and psychology right now.
Yes, he's far more qualified than I am. So he's the man you really want to listen to in this session here. But of course, this is an Oxbridge session. So while we both did go to Oxford and we're more familiar with the Oxford course, you also have interviews if you're applying for psychology or psychological and behavioural sciences. I think they called it over at Cambridge, and this will be great practice for that as well. And it is an interview workshop. So we'll touch very, very briefly on the TSA, which I imagine most of you will be doing, or just entrance tests generally. At the start, this will take about 5-10 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to the actual interviews where Sam and I have our own little interview sessions that we've put together. And we'll go through those with the group as an online thing. So this is also actually quite handy because if you're not aware, so all of the Oxford interviews are online and all but 6 of Cambridge colleges are doing their interviews online. There's only 6 that are doing it in person. So if you do get invited to an interview, congratulations. But if you get invited to an interview, this is almost exactly what the interview might look like. It will be 2 people on a Zoom call, except the only difference is that you'll be actively talking to them rather than messaging in a Q&A. But this is pretty good practice, and it will also demonstrate the inherent technical difficulties that will happen in any interview. So just to touch on that, things like that will happen. It's absolutely fine. We don't hold it against you. We don't give people places based on who's got the best Wi-Fi. So yeah, don't worry. If there's any catastrophic tech issues and your interview can't continue, that's also fine. You just message someone and then we will reschedule it for you. Cool. So that's the general intro patter out of the way. I think we will briefly touch on the admissions test because those should be coming up very soon for you guys. So everyone applying for Oxford, you'll definitely be sitting the TSA, which I hope you're all registered for. If this is coming as a shock to you, maybe speak to someone. And for Cambridge, I'm not sure if you guys have a centralized one. I think you might do, but there are a lot of colleges that have their own little tests that they might make you sit as well. And my very, very, very quick piece of advice for smashing the admissions test is just do some past papers in time conditions. And you don't need to do all of them. You just got to do like 4 or 5 or so. They're not something that you can revise for. You can't just like get the questions ready before you go in, as you could with like, potentially psychology A level, where you're thinking that they might ask you to evaluate this certain theory, so you just revise that theory to death. It's very much just answering questions that you won't have seen before, and it's just like logical thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, that sort of stuff. So the questions will be unfamiliar. Things you can familiarize yourself with is just the format of it. What does section 1 look like? What does section 2 look like? The timings, styles of questions, because there are patterns that you see. There's like very certain types of questions that I like to ask. And if you do about 4 or 5 of those past papers, then you'll know what questions they like to ask, what the style of the question is. You'll get the timings down, and you'll just get yourself to a point where you can sit down on the day, open the paper, and not panic. And if you're at that stage, I think that is about as prepared as you can be. So do a couple of past papers. Don't need to do all of them out there, but all of the past papers are available online. So just go out, have a go at them, get familiar with it, set them in time conditions. That's everything I would have to say, really. I think that's what all the advice boils down to. But Sam, if you can remember back to your TSA, if there's any little bits of advice you can give there.
The only other thing I would add is that if you go online, I think this is still the case. I think it's on the exam board website. You can download this booklet, and it goes through each type of question that they ask. So there's only, say, 6 type of problem solving questions and like 5 non-verbal reasoning questions or something like that. And it goes through what those are and works through an example. So I think you might be able to find that booklet on the examination board website somewhere. It's definitely worth just going through again. But my advice would be exactly the same as Ben's. Just once, even if you don't download that booklet and look through it, you'll have experienced exactly the same type and format of questions anyway if you do 4 or 5 past papers. So that's definitely the most important bit of advice.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Sam. So I'll give it just 10 seconds there if there's any questions anyone wants to ask in the Q&A on the admissions test stuff that we can get to. But if not, I think the most exciting bit is the interviews, which we can move on to pretty quickly. So general interview stuff, I think you guys kind of know what to expect based on some of the stuff we've told you already, and also just what you're going to see now. It's not like a job interview. It's no, describe yourself in 60 seconds. What qualities can you bring to the degree? That sort of stuff. It's very much just come in, they'll just have a little bit of patter at the start to get you comfortable talking, and then they'll delve straight into subject-specific stuff. And that is what we're going to give you a little taste of today. So, yeah, most of them will be online. We don't care what you wear. We don't care how formally you talk. We don't care what your background looks like. You don't need a shelf full of, all of, all the big books in psychology. You also don't need like posters behind you. That's not going to help or disadvantage you in any way. We don't care about that stuff. We just care about what you say. And it's not so much right or wrong answers we care about. It's the thought process. So in the actual interview, when it's just you and the interviewers, just think out loud is the big piece of advice. Verbalize the entire thought process. Just say everything you're thinking. Because if it's a good thought, they'll say, yep, cool, this sounds interesting, let's work on this. If you're going completely down the wrong path, they'll say, I can see why you might think that, but it wouldn't work for this reason, so let's try something else. And that's absolutely fine. I went very wrong in my interview. I'm sure Sam went wrong in his interviews, as infallible as I think he is otherwise. You can backtrack, that's absolutely fine. You can correct yourself. But if you just sit there in silence for 5 minutes and then give an answer and they have no idea how you got to that answer, they might say, no, that's wrong, and have absolutely nothing to work with at that point. And it's not like congratulations, you said the right answer, here's your spot. People can say right answers, even though in lots of cases there are no right and wrong answers. People can say right answers, but have no idea how they got there. They just like, oh yeah, I learned this before. But if they can't explain how they got to that answer, not great. It's the thought process we're looking for. So hopefully this will give you guys a little bit of practice there. So we've got the Q&A that you can do questions in. You can basically use that as a chat that everyone can see. We also have the chat that just me and Sam can see if you want to use that to get in contact with us. But I've also seen, apparently, if I click on panelists, I think I can allow people to talk individually as my special host privilege. So if you really want, if there's something that you want to be brave, hop on the call and say, put that in the chat, and we can unmute you, and then we can.
It might be easier if they raise their hand, maybe. I don't know if.
Yeah, or raise your hand. I'm not sure if anyone. Can you guys raise your hand? Can someone just put in the chat if you can raise your hand? Because I think that's something. Oh yeah, no, people can raise their hand. Fantastic. And before anyone does jump on to talk, do bear in mind that we are also recording this session, so hopefully that's okay. Just in case people can't make it. So, with all of that out of the way, I think, Sam, do you want to kick off? One thing I will briefly mention, if I've been to anyone's schools before and I've done a psychology interview with you, me and Sam are both going to do one. We're doing mine at the end because it's the one I've been using with schools. So if you've seen mine before, when Sam's done, you can leave the call, having seen something new. But for anyone who's not seen either of us before, then, it'll be something new the whole way through. But yeah, I think I'll throw it over to you now, Sam.
Okay, great. Cheers, Ben. I'll just share my screen now. So yeah, welcome to the psychology access session or the interview workshop that we're doing today. You can see in the background that is Brasenose, where Ben and I live/work. So yeah, it's a beautiful place. But I'll just start with a question. And when you start any interview in Oxford, you might just get thrown a really broad general question like this. So William James, who you may have come across if you do A-level psychology, one of the founding fathers of psychology, famously asked the question very simply, what is an emotion? And I guess that's a big question, but if any of you have any ideas, what do you think an emotion is, then you can write them down in the Q&A, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Or alternatively, you can raise your hand and say something, as Ben said earlier. Yeah, I appreciate that you might need to spend a while typing this, so no need to rush.
I've also saw someone raise hand.
Yeah, I can't see hands raised, so you might.
I think that's on me then. So
yeah, I think it's just you. Yeah.
Wonderful. Sorry, can the person who raised their hand just raise their hand again, please? That was a mistake. Okay, no worries. But there was a question in the Q&A.
Interesting. I like that, Alexandra. That's actually a very good answer. We could go into that in a lot of detail, but if other people can see it, an internal movement, a feeling within that causes a movement in thoughts/moods/feelings. I think both of you are on the right lines. A mental state brought about by physical change. Interesting. The answers that I've seen so far are all on the right lines, especially the one by Alexandra is really interesting, and we can go into that a bit further maybe if we were in an actual interview, because there have been quite a few theories about how, say, the sensory information is combined with, say, top-down knowledge, cognitive expectations and knowledge of the world in producing an emotion. Perhaps it could be defined as a mental state as a response to either internal or external stimulus that you can then use to guide the decisions to make next. A neurological process that can manifest itself in behavior. Okay, great. I like all of these answers. And you're all roughly along the right lines. I think they would all be great first responses to that question. So yeah, they're all along roughly the right lines. But it's interesting to see that. And if I then went on to the next slide, which I'm trying to do, I don't know if it's frozen. There we go. I think from the range of answers that you've given, it should be relatively apparent. There isn't necessarily a scientific consensus about what an emotion is, how it should be defined, or even how it can be measured. So there was this study in the 1980s which found 92 separate definitions of an emotion, and even this was just limited to experimental psychology journals in English over the previous century. So lots of people have different ideas about what an emotion is, and it's perfectly understandable that each of you have your own thoughts or ideas about what an emotion is yourself. It is a bit of a lay concept that is difficult to really transfer over to a hard science where we try and use well-defined concepts, because everyone comes into the area with their own thoughts and ideas and expectations, because obviously we all experience emotions ourselves. And of course, this barely covers how the term has been used historically or is used in areas like philosophy, theology, and by non-Western thinkers. So when we start thinking about emotions, often we think about this, right? And I don't know if anyone wants to be brave enough and just type out clockwise what they think each emotion is on each of these faces.
Also, just to say, I think I've now got it working so that everyone can see everyone's chats. You just need to select to everyone, which should now be an option, which might be slightly easier than using the Q&A.
And this isn't a trick question, by the way. It's literally a very simple question. If you go from the top left all the way around in a circle, I wonder what you'd say each emotion is. Irritation, surprise, disgust, shock, happiness, sadness. Yeah, has someone else put something on the Q&A? Anger, shock, disgust, surprise, happy, exhaustion. Interesting. So there's a slight disagreement here between Jasmine and NK. And that is interesting. But broadly, we'll go on to the next slide and see. But broadly, people tend to view these as the top left is anger, which you've both said. Everyone who's put it in both said. Then that would be fear, disgust. The bottom right would be sadness, then happiness, and then surprise. So Alexandra got it exactly how I would say most people who get asked this question and get shown these photos talk about it. So anger, fear, disgust, sadness, happiness, and surprise. So it's interesting. And these photos are actually used in actual empirical psychology experiments going back to the 60s and 70s, mainly by a guy called Ekman. And Ekman, you might have come across him in A-level psychology. I didn't. I did A-level psychology and we never studied him, but you might have done, depending on your exam board. But he came up with this idea called basic emotions theory. And essentially, he had these 6 emotions that we showed you on the previous page, and he argued that they were innate and universally produced across cultures. So because they're innate, it doesn't matter where in the world you grew up or whatever, like, or what culture you're a part of. All of us produce these expressions, and all of them are acknowledged and understood as being distinct emotions. So if we were going to define an emotion, each one would be associated with its own neural activation, so emotion programs. But what else might be within like the individual category of, say, an emotion, say happiness? What else might it be associated with? What else would the emotion happiness be characterized by across different instances? There's a few different things you could argue here. Mm. So I've seen some interesting comments. So Jasmine said physical behavior. That is a really interesting one because Ekman and evolutionary psychologists and Iram has said something similar. So observable behavior would probably argue the yes, that each emotion is associated with its own, say, set of different physical behaviors, because the whole idea that Ekman tried to pioneer was that each emotion was the deliberate bodily response, or it prepared the body for action in some way to respond to some difficult challenge within the environment that we were currently found ourselves within. So, for instance, fear is the classic example in this regard. And the idea was that when we were scared of something, when we see a stimulus that causes fear, the body, the heart rate increases, adrenaline gets pumped through the body, and that helps us prepare to like fight or flight, say. So those behaviors would be fight or flight. And so you could say that individual emotions are associated with observable behaviors. Body language is a really good one. That also links to facial expressions. So, of course, these are all just observable responses of the body that we produce to show other people that we're feeling a certain emotion. Jasmine also mentioned specific stimuli, and that's good as well, of course. Say if you see a snake, you're more likely to be scared than happy. But of course, there is variation in this. I bet some people out there love snakes and wouldn't be scared at all. But by and large, I guess you could say these type of things. One thing that we can talk about is physiological or autonomic activity. So I don't think anyone mentioned that, but it was kind of implied with the fight or flight thing that, say, if you're scared, then it produces a specific bodily response in terms of the hormones released, the neurotransmitters released, and the different parts of the internal organs that are activated. Also, facial expression, which you saw on the previous slide. And also, you could argue the same subjective experience. So if you go up to someone in the street and say, do we experience distinct emotions, and are they associated with their own, physiological activity? Most people would say yes, instinctively or intuitively, and that's because we experience each emotion in a different way, and we can, by and large, if we have reasonable ability to understand our own bodies, we can tell when we're feeling scared, or we can tell when we're feeling happy, or tell when we're feeling sad. So the idea is that each emotion is like this program that is associated with its own set of neural activity or brain activity, autonomic activity, facial expression, and subjective experience. So here's another big question. How would you test whether these basic emotions were distinct and innate? I'll give you a hint. Think about what innate means. I'll be interested to see some of your answers. Okay, I've seen 3 or 4 answers so far, and all of them are picking up on either one or both of the 2 ways people have done it. So one way, as lots of people have said already, is to test babies or infants or across the lifespan. And the other main way that experimenters have chosen to do this is to carry out studies across multiple cultures. So all of you seem to have got at least one of those ideas, which is really good, because then if you were in an actual interview, we could go into whichever one of them you mentioned and talk about some of the experiments that have been done to test this theory in that domain, and then talk about, the different methodological challenges or techniques that have been used. So in this instance, I actually have slides on both cross-cultural studies and infant studies, but the first ones I'd like to talk about are about the cross-cultural studies. So yeah, we have cross-cultural evidence. And the main one comes from Ekman and Friesen, who was an anthropologist in the 1970s. And they went around the world and basically showed these photos that I showed to you at the start to different groups of people and asked them what they would label these facial expressions. And as you can see here, when they went to the US, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Japan, they found relatively high levels of agreement across these different countries. So this Ekman took to support his theory. He was like, it doesn't matter whether you're born in Brazil or United States or Japan, you recognize this face is disgust, this one is happiness, and this one is anger. What are the problems or the potential problems with this interpretation? And there's a couple of them. So what is the problem with looking at those results and saying, facial expressions must be, these distinct basic emotions must be innate and present across all cultures? Yeah, Bridget said it assumes you can only have 6 emotions. That's definitely one problem. It's a pretty arbitrary number, isn't it? Not everyone presents emotions in the same way. Correlational. You're all touching on problems with this field, but none of you yet have talked about perhaps the most important problem as to why this can't show the universality of emotions. Yeah, but Jasmine, you're kind of touching on it. So you say only 5 countries, but that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's only, limited resources. So how would you, what's wrong with these 5 countries in particular, say, or what's wrong with these 5 cultures in particular? Marjan, you've said, yeah, not all cultures, but clearly, like, Japanese culture is extremely different to American culture. It's extremely difficult to Brazilian culture. So what's the problem with presenting these? Yeah, Rabia, you've talked about neurodivergent people. That is a big issue, but that's not exactly what I'm looking for. Melody, I think you're getting more towards the right lines with industrialization in the individualistic cultures. Poshmal, that's a good answer. So I'll give you some ideas. So one problem is, well, these are the 2 main problems, and you've all touched them to some extent. But one is that even though obviously people in Japan and people in Brazil and people in America have very different cultures and upbringings, there's clearly shared culture there, that they all watch television, they all look at magazines, they're all these industrialized or relatively rich societies where you can see people or you come into contact with people, which is intercultural contact, the second point, from different cultures. So essentially, it wouldn't necessarily be surprising, even if facial expressions weren't innate, for everyone in these cultures to share the same facial expressions for different emotions, because they could have just learned, like people in Japan or people in Brazil could have watched American TV shows and watched American magazines, and over a number of decades learned, okay, if I'm scared, I'm going to produce this facial expression because that's, the social norm that I've seen on TV. And same with intercultural contact, like even though they are quite far apart, people from America have met and visited people from Japan, and over the centuries and thousands of years, this intercultural contact might create, a global facial expression that is obviously quite adaptive, because you're more likely to understand people from different cultures if you know what emotions they're experiencing. So how would you what cultures could you possibly go to basically get around this problem? Or where would you need to go? Who would you need to test to avoid these problems? Yep, everyone seems to have the right idea here. So isolated cultures, tribal cultures cut off from technology, tribes in rural areas. I like when Yan Lin's talking of the Sentinelese. They're always, I was actually on Wikipedia the other day looking up the Sentinelese. If anyone's interested, I think they're a really interesting group of people to study. Although, as Wen Yan has said, they're quite hostile, so we haven't really studied them very much, because anyone who goes onto their island tends to get killed. But yeah, you're all along the right lines. So these remote tribal cultures, you haven't come into contact with people. And believe it or not, that is exactly what Ekman did. So this man in the middle here is Ekman, and you can see he went to Papua New Guinea, and found these tribes who lived up in the rural rainforest mountains in Papua New Guinea and who'd basically never come across Western people before, or at least not until about 2 or 3 years earlier, and went and did a load of experiments on them. So you can see here, I actually cut off Papua New Guinea from that first diagram. You can see it at the bottom now. And it wasn't just anyone from Papua New Guinea, as I said, it was these very much isolated tribes who'd never really come across Western people or any technology before. And you can see when they were given these photos, their rates of agreement with American or Japanese or Chilean participants were much lower. Even happiness, only 82% saw this face as expressing happiness. So one could argue that this is extremely problematic. However, Ekman claimed that these results still supported his hypothesis. And I'll now ask you why. So this is a question that's largely about statistics or probability. So that's my hint to you. But why would Ekman claim that even though, say, only 44% of the people from these isolated tribes in Papua New Guinea thought that that face showed disgust, why would this still supposedly support his hypothesis, according to Ekman? Jasmine said the results are still significant due to the large sample size. That doesn't really explain it, because it could be significant as in like significantly different from the American or Argentinian samples. So that's not quite what we're looking for. The 44% may be an outlier. That's true, it might be an outlier, but it isn't exactly a great way to go about doing science by just disregarding results that disprove your theory. Maybe it was still a majority out of all the answers. That's along the right lines. Definitely more along the right lines than the other answers. Anyone else have any ideas? 44% still significant. It is. You're along the right lines, but it's significant compared to what? I think that might be an easy way of phrasing it. Okay. Significant compared to the range of other answers that the tribe gave, or just still in agreement, just not 100% agreement. Jasmine, I think you're along the right lines if I understand what you're saying. Yeah, may have been greater variation, but ultimately the majority of answers would still have supported the basic motions theory. 50% agreement is still significant when compared to no agreement. Yeah, you're all getting along roughly the right lines now, I think. But essentially, it was because agreement scores were still above chance levels. So they were given, say, 4 options or 6 options, depending on the study, and they still chose the right label in this study more likely than chance. So for instance, say you see a face and you get given 4 options. Is this face angry? Is this face sad? Is it scared? Or is it showing disgust? Then if there's no universality in facial expressions whatsoever, then you'd expect these tribes in Papua New Guinea to pick each one 25% of the time, right? But you saw even at the lowest rates, they were picking 44% of the time, which is still significantly above chance levels. And so Ekman said, okay, there's more variation, but they're still above chance, and maybe there's reasons for this variation. So he attributed them to methodological problems. Can anyone think of any problems with testing these samples that might affect the answers that they give and might reduce the rates of agreement with, well, compared to, say, American participants? Language barriers, that's a really good one. Unfamiliar with experiments, also a very good one, and may not fully comprehend the instructions. So to Ekman and Friesen's credit, they have a lot of detractors because they're kind of ethically dubious, their research, but they did embed themselves within this tribal population for quite a few months or even years beforehand, and they took along trained anthropologists. So they did try to do this the right way, or at least they claimed to. Having said that, you guys are right that each of these is a problem. And Ekman actually cited lots of what you've just said. Yeah, the woman in the picture was a white woman. So that's a really good point. And we could go into cross-race effects there as well, about the woman in the picture was white. But Ekman and Friesen realized this, and they also did variants of the experiment where they presented photos of people from those tribes themselves. So they did try and get around that or deal with that problem. Investigator effects, that's also another interesting one. Each of these, if you mentioned them within the interview, would possibly go down a different route. But obviously, because there's, you know, like almost 30 of you in this route, in this interview, I have to go down like the way I think it was most likely to go. So some examples could be poor translations. So people mentioned that say, even though they did have a translator within their research group, the direct translation between the English and the language in this tribal language may not have been fully accurate, or, you know, in different languages, there's different nuances with different words, right? So it may not have captured exactly the same thing. Someone also mentioned task unfamiliarity. If you're living in a tribe that's been isolated in the mountains of Papua New Guinea for thousands of years, and all of a sudden a random white man comes along and presents you loads of photos, which you probably haven't even seen photos before, and gets you to do tests, you're probably not used to this whole process of you're probably not used to the whole process of even just doing experiments at all, or you know, even getting asked questions like these type of things. And there was also stuff to do with memory problems, but we'll skip that one because you have to know more about the task design. But yeah, Ekman basically said things like this affected the answers of these tribal participants to the extent that they didn't have the same agreement levels as American participants, but yet they were still above chance levels, and yet it still supported his theory. However, others who disagree with Ekman, so one in particular is this guy called James Russell, who's based in California, and he argued instead that no, these participants from Papua New Guinea were actually aided, and if they didn't have certain aspects of the experiment in the way that Ekman presented it, that helped them pick their labels, then it would have been at chance levels. They would have picked 25, they would have picked each face or each label 25% of the time. And so this leads to the question, what, for instance, did Russell suggest may have helped the participants from Papua New Guinea to choose the correct labels, rather than, say, perform at chance levels? This is a tough question, so it's good to think about. Yeah, I like that. So experimental bias, unconscious body language and facial expressions may have influenced their choices. That's true in virtually all experiments. That it's been well documented that if an experimenter has a hypothesis, then even if they don't know they're doing it, maybe like subconsciously or implicitly, they encourage participants to pick specific answers that support their hypotheses. And that has been shown across numerous studies in numerous fields. That's definitely one that's a possibility. Anyone else have any ideas? Someone said they may have been anxious during the test, but I think that was in response to the previous question. Low ecological validity, perfect. That's what we're looking for as well. Yeah, it may have become accustomed to the mannerisms of the experimenter. That's definitely a possibility. I really like Julia's point about low ecological validity, though. That's the one I was going to go into a bit more, but each of them is correct. Conformity is possible, Rabia, but I don't think they did it at the same time as other members of their tribe, so I'm not sure if that's exactly correct. Social desirability, interesting. I don't see where social desirability would come into it, but maybe if we were in an interview, you could explain why you thought that. But anyway, moving on. Ecological validity, Julia mentioned that. So what problems with ecological validity do you think there are with this experiment? Lacking mundane realism, that's essentially a way of repeating problems with ecological validity again. Of course, yeah, it's not realistic. It's not how we process facial expressions in real life, is it? By getting presented with a photo and labeling it. Yeah, they didn't see the expressions in a natural setting. Image used instead of a real person, exactly. So artificial stimuli, facial expressions are dynamic. That's a really good one that is often lost within the whole field of facial expression research. No body language, again, really good. There's no context given to the face. Okay, so yeah, some points are that they were posed. So each of these photos was posed. They were static. So someone mentioned that facial expressions are dynamic. These were static still photographs, and there was no context. So someone mentioned body language. That's a type of context. But normally, when you see a facial expression in real life, of course, it's dynamic. It unfolds over a period of time, and they're spontaneous. We don't tend to pose them unless we're smiling for a photograph. And there's context. There's the situation. There's our body language. There's what you know about me in real life. There's my eye gaze. There's what I'm wearing, or my ethnicity, or my sex, or my social background. Like, all of these things are going to influence how you interpret my facial expression, and you don't get any of this information when you're just rating an individual face on its own. So how might you test that this had an effect on matching scores in the Papua New Guinea sample? Any ideas? It's a relatively simple question, this one. Yeah, you're all along the right lines. Videos, context, all of those type of things. So, yeah, you're all along the right lines. I can see some good answers there. And in each one, we might go into a bit more detail, for instance, in an actual experiment about how you might set up, sorry, in an actual interview about how you might set up certain experiments. And maybe would you have a control condition where it was posed photos and another one where it was, spontaneous and dynamic. But yeah, you're all along the right lines. Another problem is prior exposure to faces in the experiment. So to explain, in Ekman's experiments, obviously you have multiple trials, and for each participant might see, say, 50 different faces over the course of the experiment. And what might be the problem with each participant seeing 50 different faces over the course of this experiment, where on each one they get given 4 labels and have to pick which emotion is being expressed by the face? Fatigue effect, I think that's unlikely, Gabriella, but it's an interesting one. Demand characteristics, it's all, I would say that if you're in an interview, it's all well and good saying demand characteristics, but you might want to explain. Of course, it's difficult because you can only write at this point in time, but you would probably want to expand in a bit more detail about exactly how that might be the case if you're in an actual interview. Boredom, that's a bit similar to fatigue. I think practice effects, yeah, Wenyan, you're along more of the right lines there. So essentially, the problem is that if you're seeing all these different faces over the course of the experiment, then you're comparing one face with, say, the one you saw in the previous trial, right? So if you have a face that's sad, say, but the trial before you've seen a happy face, then it's definitely a likelihood, or a possibility at least, that you're going to view the second face as more sad than it is, because you're contrasting it with the previous trial, which was a happy face. And so the idea is that over the course of an experiment, you're constantly updating your idea of what facial expression represents which emotion by comparing them to the previous faces that you've seen. And Ekman essentially said that this was a big, no, not Ekman, Russell basically said that this was a big problem because it's kind of artificial in terms of the task, that it purely depends on what faces you've seen before, and it's going to affect your judgment. But why might this not be an issue? Is this prior exposure really a problem? And if it's not a problem, why isn't it a problem? Yeah, Jasmine, you've got exactly the right answer. I think that's correct. So we see emotions every day from various people, and therefore it does simulate real life. So actually, I think that's a weak criticism of Ekman's theory. And you're right that surely every day in real life, we're seeing so many different faces and so many different facial expressions, and we're always comparing, well, maybe not consciously, but probably unconsciously, each different facial emotion is, or our interpretation or evaluation of it is based on the face relative to other faces that we see. So yeah, that's correct. Everyone else who said something similar, really well done. And finally, I know Ben wants to go on to his thing, so this will be my last slide. But there's also a problem with the forced choice format. So participants, as I mentioned earlier, chose between 4 different response options on each trial. And each one of these was a single emotional word. So it might be anger, happiness, fear, sadness. But what are the problems with this method? Yeah, of course. There are more than 4 emotions. That's correct. They may have a response that doesn't fit any of the 4 labels. Correct. Emotions aren't limited to only one at a given time. Exactly. That's a really good point. So if you'd mentioned that NK in your interview, then we might have got onto the topic of like mixed emotions. What are they? How do they come about? Are they real? Is a mixed emotion just a different emotion? By a different name, for instance. There might be an expression as noise, but characterized as anger because that's the closest choice that fits. Exactly, that's brilliant answer, Iram. Yeah, it doesn't encompass the breadth and depth of emotions, forces participants into choosing one emotion. Yeah, but they may have to tailor their initial opinion to one of the choices that may not be accurate. Exactly. All of these answers are really good, actually. I'd be very impressed in this interview. But yeah, you're right. The main problem is that it leads to this thing which we're calling the best approximation method. So you may have any interpretation of this face that you see, but you have to channel that interpretation into a single emotional term. So someone at the start mentioned you could think it as annoyance, but you don't get the choice of annoyance. So you have to pick anger, but that's not necessarily how you evaluate that face. And it doesn't capture these subtle differences that people might, these subtle differences in evaluation or interpretation of facial expressions that people might have, but there's no way of capturing that when you just have a forced choice method. So alternatively, you could give people the chance to just label the face with their own thoughts of what word they think works best. But of course, that has its own problems as well. And if we were in an actual interview, as I said again, we might go into difficulties with, say, just the free labeling method as well, because that does bring its own problems. And as I said, I'm going to finish now, but maybe if you did go away this evening and think what might be the problems of, say, just asking people to label the facial expression with whichever word they want to. Essentially, the idea is that there are other interpretations, and the facial expression might not even encode an emotion at all. It might just be reassurance or need for reassurance or danger or threat, all of these type of things, or even just practical action. You might make a facial expression purely for a practical purpose. So there's all these other interpretations that aren't captured at all. Anyway, I'll stop sharing my screen now, but I hope you enjoyed that session. Let me see. How do I go about?
Amazing. Thanks so much, Sam. So yeah, that was absolutely fantastic. And I saw one person in the chat say that was really interesting, and I thought so too. So hopefully you all enjoyed that. So we're going to do something a little bit different now. For the next 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more. I'm not sure if we're allowed to go over. I guess we're running this, so I don't know. Anyone can tell us to not.
Yeah, I apologize
obviously,
about going over, Ben. I hope
oh
you
no worries at all. That's fantastic. I think just keep doing this stuff. So if anyone, if you recognize this face, if I've come in and spoken psychology to you before, you can probably clock out now. But hopefully some of you stick around because we're now going to do a little bit of experimental design, which is always good to do in psychology. So, oh, hang on. From the beginning. So obviously my slide is not as exciting or as in-depth as Sam's are, but this is a very basic question. So I'm a psychologist. I have a theory that being bullied in early childhood leads to an increased risk of developing depression later on in life. How do you study that? So basically design me a study to test this idea, to test this hypothesis. Any thoughts you have in the chat, or if anyone wants to raise their hands and talk through, that'd also be cool. I'll keep the chat open. First, define bullet. Great question. Great question. Great comment. So that is, yeah, definitely that is a really, really good first step. So there are loads of ways you could define bullying. You could talk about physical bullying, psychological, verbal bullying, cyberbullying, all sorts of that. But I think so that would be a really, really good way to go. In an interview, definitely you'd have a load of discussion about that. I think if we just pick one, let's just say physical bullying, and we have some good definition of that. So we've got 2 suggestions in here immediately. So you'd probably do a correlation. Definitely could do in this area. And someone's also said do a longitudinal study, interview people who've been bullied and follow them up with monthly year intervals. You'd have to decide how you class depression. Does it have to be clinically diagnosed, or would you do this based on symptoms? Yeah, also a really good one. So we've mentioned correlation. So I'm interested. Why do you say you would do a correlation on that one? Rabia, I'm not sure if I can. I hope that's how you pronounce your name. Sorry. I'm not sure if I can like upvote or save comments, but that is a fantastic comment, and we will come to that later. So you said participants may already be predisposed to depression. So hold on to that. We'll come back to that shortly. An experimental study would be to bully someone and then throughout their life check if they have depression. But this would be unethical, causing distress. So a correlational study would be preferable. Absolutely. So that's one thing we've absolutely said we can't do is we can't go to a school somewhere and just bully a bunch of kids and then check on them later on in life. That is ethically dubious, as scientifically sound as it may be. So you said correlational, and correlational is probably something that would be really interesting. But that kind of comes into Rabia's comment a little bit there of people may be predisposed to depression. So correlational stuff, as we know, correlation does not equal causation. So there might be multiple reasons why someone is bullied and also at risk of depression separately. So while correlational would be really cool, I'd like to do some sort of experiment here to actually test and hopefully control for those things. And we'll touch on it a little bit later. Cannot determine causality. Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. Control group with people who haven't had experiences of bullying. And those who have, bullying isn't really on a spectrum. Even one-off incidents can trigger a series of reactions. That's a really, really fair point. So maybe this is something that is hard to do as a correlation because there's not really levels. Maybe it is just as black and white as being bullied and being not bullied despite the severity. So that's a really interesting philosophical question there, and definitely something that in an interview you could dive into loads more. But we are jumping around a little bit just because there's so many things in the chat. So I think we've got the bones of a pretty good also, yeah, there's the counterpoint here. How severe will the bullying have to be? Different people react differently. So I think loads and loads of good points, but we'll jump on, I think, the bones of, I think, a really good study that are developing here. So you have a longitudinal study. I really like that idea. Obviously, we want to see, we're talking about results later on in life, so you kind of have to do longitudinal. So we'll take some children. We're not going to bully them. We'll take some children who have already been bullied and some children who haven't been bullied. Let's say we've got, we'll touch on that a little bit. Children who have been bullied, children who haven't been bullied, and then just follow them up later on in life. And we'll use some type of depressive index. Maybe we'll look at clinical diagnosis, maybe we'll look at severity of symptoms, but some form of measuring depression. But very simply, we'll do a longitudinal study, a longitudinal natural experiment. So let's think about our sample a little. Yeah, maybe use the DSM. Absolutely, definitely could do that. So let's think a little bit about our sample here. So how are we going to decide who's been bullied and who's not been bullied? So we've touched on this a little bit more, a little bit already, but who am I going to go into? Let's say there's a school or a couple of schools that we're working with. Who are we going to ask? We could ask their teachers. Yeah, definitely. So teachers are definitely people we can ask. Should we do parents? Definitely, we can ask parents. Peers. I've done this several times before where people have said ask the bullies, which is an interesting one of just going in, hey, are you the bully? Can you tell me who you're bullying, please? Unethical in my opinion, but can ask counselors, definitely. So I think the first three, or the first couple of responses were I think the ones I like the most. So children, teachers, and parents. So can we just think of, if we take them individually, can we think of some pros and cons of asking children themselves whether or not they're being bullied? Other than the ethical stuff, let's assume that we have ethical guidance on this. We've gone in, we're trained to work with children. We do it very carefully. Children might lie, might not understand what bullying entails, social desirability, might be dishonest, either due to fear or desire to persist. Yeah, loads of reasons there. So the children, for whatever reason, might not be completely truthful. So fantastic, but they're also the ones actively being bullied or not. So potentially, they're the richest source of information there. So if we move on to parents, what are some pros and cons of asking parents? May not be aware. Yeah, definitely. Just don't see all the things. Protective of children. And I've only heard one side of the story. Good outsider perspective. Yeah, they do have a good outsider's perspective into the situation. Yeah, they don't know what happens at school. May over-exaggerate the extent of the bullying. Definitely. So you could ask them, and these might be reasons why that's not. But they do also, bullying doesn't just happen at school. Bullying happens in the neighborhood, and maybe that's something that the parents might be aware of and might be a little bit more objective than the children. We can argue that. And then let's talk about teachers. What are some pros and cons of teachers? I'm really, really excited to see there's been loads of things in the chat, and it's really, because they're all great points. May not be aware of students' trusted source of comfort and help, best knowledge of what happens inside the school. Teachers may have favorite students. That's a very good point. They might have favorite students. Only see children for a limited time each day and in a limited context. Da, 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 da. Teachers must support all children and feel obligated to stay neutral. Yeah, so they might be quite objective on that. May not want to open about bullying makes the school look bad. Also a good point. So we can see loads and loads of good answers here. There's pros and cons of asking students, of asking teachers, and of asking parents. So in the perfect ideal world, who are we going to ask in this study? Yeah, all of them. Why not? Why limit yourself? Ask everyone. The children themselves, the teachers, the parents, and then let's say we already have some measure of bullying that's out there. We'll ask the teachers, all of them, and then we'll use that to come up with some composite score. And that way we'll have a pretty good idea of who's being bullied and who's not being bullied. Cool. So let's think about the control group. So that's something that is really important. And we've already mentioned there are some people out there who, for whatever reasons, they may be predisposed to being bullied and also to developing depression in an unrelated way. So like physical characteristics, being overweight, being unhealthy, like having some sort of illness, unfortunately, might mean that they're more likely to be picked on at school and also more likely to develop depression. Things like socioeconomic status, like, low family income, again, more likely to be picked on, and also potentially it could be a cause of stress later on. So there's loads of things that could confound this experiment. So in the perfect world, we really want a group that are, where the bullied and the non-bullied children are really similar to each other in every way you can think of, except for the fact that one's being bullied and this group's being bullied and this group isn't. So what sort of sample do you think we'll look for that? Like so we've got a bullied sample. Who would we look for as the control group there? Matched pair design. Yeah, definitely match pairs. So that could be a good way of doing it. And I just want to point out, so there's a lot of psychological terminology that's been thrown around here, which is really, really fantastic. If anyone's not doing psychology A level, but still wants to do psychology at university, because A level is not a requirement, you don't need to know the names of these things. If you just kind of describe something and that ends up being what match pairs is or some other experimental design, then, that's absolutely fine. You don't need to know the names of things. Match pair design could definitely be one. Proportional representation of ethnicities, age, gender, socioeconomics. Yeah, definitely. But if we think you know, put your mind back in yourself as a 10-year-old. Who's really similar to you? Your friends? Yeah, definitely. So we could look at a school. We could look in one school. Siblings is really good. So you could look at siblings because they share like, you know, some sort of genetics. They also share some sort of familial environment. And if we get even more specific than siblings, this might not apply to you. Twins, yes, absolutely. So the gold standard, monozygotic. So someone's put one of the magic words in there. So the gold standard for this experiment is basically if you can find a bunch of twins, even identical twins, where one's being bullied and one isn't. In that case, you really got a feel for the one that is being bullied when they're basically identical to their twin who isn't. And it might seem like a really impractical sample to find. And it's not easy, but it is a sample that do exist. And loads of these studies have been done before. So I think that is a really, really fantastic way of doing this study. And there are lots of things I'd like to touch on a little bit more, or like hints that I wouldn't have given and just, you know, plugged away at a little bit more for you doing an interview. But just in the interest of time, move on. But yeah, that would be an amazing study. Pick some monozygotic twins, Sisu who are bullied and not being bullied by asking themselves, asking the teachers, asking their parents, follow them up for a little while, and then later on in life, see how they're doing. Cool, fantastic. So we're going to move a little bit away from this design now, and there's just one little thing I want to touch on just before we finish, because we're already slightly over here. So we talked about things that might influence the risk of depression. If we now just focus on depression, we've talked about genes. So maybe there's a family predisposition to depression. There's also maybe like familial environment, so low economic status, like a violent household, stuff like that. So if we just think, what is it that puts people at risk? Dysfunctional schemas, yeah, that's a great one. There's also, my slide doesn't seem to be wanting to move. Fantastic. So this is a graph here. It's slightly awkward. I'm just also because mine's right in the middle of my screen, and that's not helpful. So what we want to do is we want to think who is the most likely to develop depression. So you can see here we've got this incredibly artistic and well drawn out graph that I've produced. So we've got our monozygotic and our dizygotic twins. Someone's already put the word in there, but can someone quickly just explain? Anyone know what monozygotic and dizygotic means? Yeah, so monozygotic, 100% of the genes from the same egg. So identical twins, and then dizygotic, yeah, share 50% of their genes. And yeah, okay, so non-identical twins. So monozygotic, I'm not sure if people can see my mouse, but monozygotics on the top row are identical. Dizygotics on the bottom row are non-identical twins. And you can see in this first column here, the people with the red bar underneath them, we know that they have depression. We know that we've gone in, we've checked, and you know they have some sort of diagnosis. The people on the second column, on the right-hand side of the screen, the twins with no bar underneath them, we know that they don't have depression. We've gone in, we've checked them, and they don't have depression. What we don't know anything about are the people with the green bars underneath them. And what we want to do is rank which of these twins with the green lines underneath them do we think is most likely to develop depression? So a twin who has an identical, so someone who has an identical twin with depression, a non-identical twin with depression, an identical twin without, and a non-identical without. So I was going to say, which do we think is the most likely? I've already seen a couple of people say, so top left is most likely, since they share the same genetic predisposition as their twin with depression. Yeah, so absolutely. So they share a genetic disposition. So we imagine the person, the people with depression, we imagine that they have some sort of risk in their genes. And the top left, you know, they share all of their genes. So we imagine they share all of that risk. But what else do they share with their twin? Yeah, also in the same environment. So we imagine the people with depression, we imagine their genes are risky and their environment are risky. So top left, they share all of the genes and all of the environmental risk as well. So who do we think is second most likely? DZ twin with depression. Yeah. So what is that? Bottom left. Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say that's correct. Yeah, same environment again. So we assume they're showing their risky environment. And they're sharing the same risky genes, but not as many of the risky genes because there's that 50% deviance as the monozygotic. So that leaves us with the two people whose twins don't have depression. Which is most likely which is least likely overall and which is second least likely? Bottom, so some saying DZ, some people saying bottom right. Someone saying monozygotic is second least likely. Least likely bottom right. Top right, since they share the same genetic. Yeah, so I think when you have it fantastically spot on there. So top right is the least likely since they share the same lack of genetic and environmental predisposition. So when the twin doesn't have depression, we can assume that the environment is pretty safe and their genes are pretty safe. So the twin on the top right has all of these same unrisky genes and all of the same environment. And then what is the key thing with bottom right? Why are they at more of a risk than the people on the top right? They have less shared genes, so they only share 50% of the genes. And what do we not know about the 50%? Yeah, not 100% the same genes. What genes they share? Yeah, so Jasmine, they're spot on. So whether the other 50% contains the genetic disposition. So we can assume, bottom right, that 50% of their genes are safe. We can't make any assumption on the others. We have no idea. That 50% that they don't share could be incredibly risky for all we know. Whereas the people on the top, we can assume that 100% of their genes are safe. So I think there was a lot of comments there. There's a lot to keep up with. I might not have singled out everyone that said something, but I'm not sure if you've been looking at the chat, Sam, and I know you looked over my notes for this before, and you're just good at psychology, so you probably would have come to all these right conclusions as well. I don't think I saw anyone say something that was outlandish. I think everyone had really, really fantastic ideas there.
Yeah, I completely agree. It seemed like you guys all were on the right lines with both mine and Ben's workshop or interview workshops. And yeah, there was lots of really intelligent, really useful suggestions.
Yeah, fantastic. And then we're out of time. But the only thing I would just want to throw this out there, because this is normally how I finish it. So this is a graph of, genetic liability, highest to lowest. That's exactly what we just went through. Risk of onset of major depression, severe life event, absent or present. And basically, all I would say is what is the main big takeaway from this? And all I want people to actually get to at the end is that genetics is really important when a severe life is present. It makes this big difference. The difference between the genetic risk is tiny when a severe life event is absent. And basically, there's just, the very simple conclusion, no trick question. You can't just look at the environment. You can't just look at genetics. You need to look at both of them. So cool. I think you guys did really, really fantastic there. So experimental design is a huge part of psychology. It's definitely something that could come up in an interview. And it's good to have a decent understanding of. And if you don't have an understanding of it, if you guys have not done A-level psychology before, anyone in the chat, you all did really, really well in teasing out and getting to a really, really fantastic study. So I think, unless there's any final burning questions that anyone wants to pop in the Q&A, I think that's just about it, because we're already about 10 minutes over. I'm glad you found it enjoyable, Jasmine. That's the big thing. So that's also a case of how the interviews tend to go. You'll be in there. Yeah, it's a good Star Wars poster. You can't see, but there's the Wallace and Gromit one behind my head as well. Yeah, so that tends to be how the interviews go. You go into them, you're really nervous, but the tutors are amazing. They're talking about something you're interested in, and 5 minutes in, you're relaxed and you're enjoying it. So I'm glad that was a similar experience. So thanks very much for coming out, guys. If you have any friends who couldn't make it, Oh, final question. Oh, if you haven't studied psychology A level, how much knowledge will you be expected to have of the things others will have learned in A level? Not at all. So they're not going to assume you have any knowledge. Like I said, lots of people are throwing around sessions like match pairs, repeated measures, stuff like that, like, confounding variables. You don't need to know the names of these things. As long as you can kind of like assume that these things, like match pairs is just, make sure that these people were similar, basically. Um, to the best of your knowledge, do you
I
think
would say
be similar to this? Pretty similar, yeah.
I would say in answer to Bridget as well, is that it doesn't matter what subjects you do. So I did do A-level psychology and I also did geography and philosophy. But the other girl who got in to do psychology at Brasenose in my year did biology, chemistry, and maths, and she didn't do any psychology. And it was, if you went through the year group, I would say roughly half had done A-level psychology and half hadn't. But I don't think it affected at all whether you got in or not. So I wouldn't worry about it one bit.
Yeah, if you have the aptitude that you need to study at Oxford or Cambridge, you can probably just kind of come up with a decent study without knowing the names of all the techniques and stuff like that. So it's absolutely fine. And again, the tutors are there to help you through it. So fantastic. So I think we'll call it there. If you've had any friends, anyone you know applying for psychology who couldn't make it, we'll find a way of distributing this recording later. And I think there is, if my tech skills have worked, there should be an exit survey when you leave. So if you don't mind filling that out, that'd be amazing. But thank you very much to Sam. Thank you very much from me to you guys. You've all been fantastic. And I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you found it useful.
Yeah, I echo that. Good luck, everyone.
Amazing. See you later, guys. Thanks very
See
much.
you then.